All right, all right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Timmy Chow. I'm going to be our moderator for today's discussion. Today's panel is titled Alabama Movement Building Toward Parole Reform. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the community outreach lead of the National Parole Transformation Project, called NPTP. Which is hosting this discussion. So for those who don't know, NPTP is a coordinated campaign of strategic impact litigation and community-based advocacy that seeks to directly challenge parole systems feeding mass incarceration. Like I know my fellow folks on this panel, believe that these systems of surveillance and control have really expanded unchecked, and that they're functioning to expand the PIC, the prison industrial complex, by pushing and keeping folks into prisons. And so as a growing network of advocates, of attorneys, of impacted individuals, we really are working to develop and support both local and national efforts to end this expansion and this front of the expansion. Now this conversation today is the fourth installment of this teaching series. And we have a couple more coming up, highlighting a couple of other states. But for folks, a link will be shared at the end where you can find our previous three teach-ins highlighting parole reform efforts in Mississippi, California, as well as in Texas. So keep an eye out for that. All right, let's go ahead and introduce our incredible speakers that we have with us today. First is Monique DeGivenchy with the ACLU of Alabama, our Smart Justice Intake Specialist. And then we also have Alison Mollman, who is the Interim Legal Director. Hi, Alison. Hi, Monique. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, Timmy. Thank you for having us. Hi, everyone who has decided to participate as well. Thank you for joining us.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. So one quick logistic before we hop to our first question is that there is a Q&A function that should be down in the chat on the menu bar. And so as our conversation develops today and you have any questions, feel free to drop a question in the Q&A and we'll try to get to those at the end if there's time. But all right, with that, let's get right into it. Alison, I wanted to pitch our first question to you, which is first, if you could just start off by giving us kind of a brief overview of how the parole system in Alabama functions, and yeah, the parole board specifically, how that operates in Alabama. And then if you want to add like any info or context on how that system has kind of functioned and or evolved in Alabama over time too.
Yeah, thanks, Timmy. So I've done parole work in other states throughout my career. I've done parole work in Louisiana, in Iowa, in Alabama, kind of all over the place. And there's features of Alabama's parole system that make it really unique, which like for Alabama, it's all we've known for a long time. But when you look at other states, you kind of see how unique our process is. So one thing that makes us kind of similar to other states is that our parole board members are appointed by our governor, and then they're confirmed by the legislature. But we only have 3 parole board members at any given time. And so what that means is it's the same 3 decision makers. They serve 6-year terms, and they're highly political positions. Historically, our parole rate up until about 5 years ago was around 50%. So our parole board was looking at risk assessments, at rehabilitation plans, and making decisions based on whether someone was actually ready to safely reenter society. What we've seen, though, in the last 5 years is that our parole board has gotten much more focused on punishment, on relitigating people's offenses, and really not looking at the factors that are relevant to parole, which is how someone's done in prison, what their plans for the future are, and whether they're likely to be successful. And so part of what's important to know about this is when you only have 3 people who are making the decisions, it's not like in other states where maybe there's 7 members and they're rotating in and out. People know what they're going up against, and in large part, they're going up against a 3-board panel that is inclined to deny parole. I think the other thing that's important to know about Alabama's system is we are one of 2 states that doesn't allow incarcerated people to participate in their parole hearings. There is no virtual presence. The only interaction that people have remotely close to the parole board is there's a classification officer that interviews them at the prison and puts together a report and recommendation. But it's a process where incarcerated people have really been left out of it. And the predominant voices at the hearing are those of law enforcement, of district attorney's office, the attorney general's office, and victims groups. So the deck is really stacked against folks. And then you add in this highly politicized board, and it makes it really, really challenging to get the outcomes that people deserve.
I mean, with that, thank you for that overview. My next question is like, with that kind of context, as you say, the chips are stacked against folks, right? I'm wondering if y'all could speak to some of the kind of biggest concerns, more specifically to the concerns and challenges, choke points that y'all are seeing from your particular perspectives.
I'll take that. So similar to what Alison was stating a few minutes ago or a few seconds ago, the challenges are really a really largely politicized board, right? We have 3 people who are making the main decisions. These decisions are supposed to be based off of a risk assessment that is produced by the risk assessment unit, in the sense of how the person's behavior has been while they're in prison. The problem, again, is that it is almost, so if you have an opportunity to look at the risk assessment, which is located on the Alabama Department of Parole and Pardons website, you can find it there. If you have an opportunity to look at the risk assessment, it starts off with discussing the person's crime to begin with. So that's one factor that they're already holding against a person before they even come to discuss their behavior, their progress, or their ability to actually be reintegrated into the community as a productive member. So that's the first thing. Additionally, you have several other challenges. You have the challenges of the opposing parties who are coming in to introduce the actual crime as it relates to the parole hearing. And so you don't really hear about the person's progress, as you more so hear about how the person committed the crime, how they attempted to either do the crime and the outcome of the crime and the impact of the crime, but not really so much a discussion around what they may have learned from that incident, what they may have did in that incident, and even in cases where we have victims who have forgiven the actual person who was, convicted, they still have been opposed against by the legal parties, such as like the Attorney General's office, Vocal, which is a victim crime and leniency group who specializes in victim advocacy and most times comes to the hearings to speak out in opposition to the release of many people. And so you see yourself kind of at a disconnect, because if you're a person who's up for parole, you don't know that you have all of these fighting forces against you at the parole hearing, because you're not even allowed to go to the parole hearing. So you have no idea. In your mind, you're thinking, oh, well, I've been good in jail. I've done everything that I need to do. I've taken all my classes. You're telling your family, go to the parole board, advocate for me. Tell them that I have a place to live. Tell them I have a job to come back to. Tell them that I'll be supported. And the family who's advocating has no idea that they're really advocating against a system that is already made their decision about the release of this individual from a general standpoint and not from an individualized standpoint. If I sum that up.
Yeah, thank you for I think those challenges, resonate with a lot of the themes that we've been seeing in other states in terms of just the just how little avenues for folks in that, once they are in that process, the kind of little windows of support that even the process itself is allowing for folks. So that, yeah, thank you for breaking that down. You know, I wanted to, Alison, did you have anything to add to that before my next question? No? Okay. You know, I want to get to talking about the Parole Watch program, but before that, you know, just to give folks an even more clear context of, like, before we move into that initiative, is a question for you, Monique, as someone who spearheaded that effort. What is it? Can you give our audience like a sense of what it's like to actually attend a parole hearing in Alabama, and who are the players, and yeah, what's that room like?
Absolutely. So one thing I like to tell people when they are coming with me to the parole hearing is that they should expect to have some vicarious trauma. And I say that to not deter people from wanting to go, but to give them an idea of what the atmosphere actually really does feel like when you are in the hearing room. The first thing, when you come to the hearings, you are greeted, of course, by security. Most people are separated between those who are opposing the release, and then there are those who are advocating. So those people are placed into separate waiting areas. And then when the hearing commences, everybody is all brought into the hearing room. And at that time, those who are advocating for the release are allowed to give their testimony, which is about 2 minutes long per person. In that testimony, they can, state the facts as to how they see it as it relates to why this person should be released. They can advocate as to what they may have accomplished, why they're there. And they can also discuss their reentry plan if there is one that they've developed with their family member, or that they have access to. After the supporting family or supporting people are finished, it then moves on to the opposing parties. The opposing parties is actually a little bit more where the vicarious trauma comes into play, because as I and Alison stated earlier, the hearing almost feels like a retrial. And so when you come with the opposing parties are normally discussing the case in detail. They're discussing exactly what occurred to either the victim or in the crime. Most cases, if they're opposing, it is a victim that is involved. And in that case, you normally have two different groups. You have Vocal, who I stated before is a victim advocacy group that normally meets with the victims beforehand to go over facts of the case and to kind of like prep victims beforehand how to present to the board, which people who are coming to support, they don't have. So let me also state that. And then you have the AG's office, who would normally kind of, have the same conversation that Vocal has in opposition to the release of the individual. And then sometimes, depending on the severity of the crime, you may even have the actual prosecuting DA that is coming to oppose as well. And so once both parties have testified, the parole board then makes their decision. It would seem like those testimonies would have an impact on the decisions, but I have to be very transparent and very upfront with everyone to let you guys know that these decisions are made before the testimony actually occurs. And I say that because, again, the parole board makes it pretty clear that they do review the cases prior to convening that day, and that they have gathered all of the information that they have received. But most times when there is an opposing AG and an opposing Vocal advocate, or even an opposing DA, they are always asking for a denial and a max set off, which is normally 5 years. And most times that decision is upheld by the parole board in agreement with the opposition team. And so that is what the landscape looks like. And so you have a lot of family that are coming into the hearing, and they are coming in hopeful. They're coming in with they're praying at hearings, and they're really thinking that there's a shot. And what they are unaware of is that these decisions are already being made before they even come to testify for their family. And that is the actual landscape of what's actually really going on here. You can almost predict who is going to be released and who's going to be denied just based on the crime that they have committed, based on the amount of years that they have, and based on the fact that, they don't really have any concrete roots in the community that would say to the board they feel comfortable letting this person out.
Yeah, I think thank you for that, Monique. And I think it's perfect context to kind of lead into talking about the Parole Watch effort to begin with, right? As an effort that y'all led, and I had the special opportunity to help support. But I just wanted to uplift how it seems like not only are folks at these hearings chips stacked against them in terms of a process that is like clearly where you're saying, as you said, decisions likely have already been made on the determination itself. It's kind of these sham hearings, but also that there's a level of support, more level support in terms of for the victims in these spaces, in these hearings, that isn't present for folks that are up for parole. But I think that's a good kind of segue to begin thinking about, like, what was the Parole Watch, right? Can you tell us about that and the goals?
Yeah, definitely. So I always tell people that I'm a bad lawyer because I don't think litigation is always the best tool to get us to the outcomes we want for our people and our clients. When we started looking at parole a couple of years ago and the crisis that was happening in Alabama, to contextualize that crisis, we've gone from a grant rate of about 50% to a grant rate under 10%. So the vast majority of people that are being considered for parole in Alabama are being denied. And when Monique references this 5-year set-off date, what that means is not only are they being denied, but they're being told you won't be considered for parole in another 5 years. For a lot of folks, that's a death sentence. They're not going to survive another 5 years in Alabama's deadly prisons. And so we started looking at this problem and thinking about solutions. And what became very, very clear is that it's tough to litigate around parole, but there's a lot that can be done around policies and advocacy. And so the legal department got together with our organizing department at the ACLU of Alabama. We're an organization that's really committed to integrated advocacy. And we started thinking about how can we make an impact on what's happening in this parole system without going into court. And one of the things that we looked to were court watch programs that have been used in other states and other communities to look at, how bail and bond is being implemented, how pretrial detention is working, and thinking about using that framework and applying it to Alabama's parole system. We felt like that was important for a few reasons. One is that incarcerated people don't get to have a presence at their parole hearings. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what is happening at parole hearings. And as Monique highlighted, there are a lot of voices in opposition that are present there, but there aren't the same level of advocates and advocacy for everyone who's being considered for parole. And so we started this project, we have long-term goals for it, but our initial goal was to do some data collection and then to increase the presence of supportive people being at parole hearings. So we did a 10-week project where the parole board meets every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And we had Monique, one of our legal interns, Timmy was down here. So I know y'all get to see Timmy on these webinars and on these talks. Timmy's someone that doesn't just do the talking, like he does the walking. And so I want to amplify that he was really, really integral to how we thought about this project and how we implemented it over the summer. But a big piece of that was we sat at every parole hearing that was conducted publicly for a 10-week period. And the other thing in terms of people not knowing what's happening with parole in Alabama has to do with documents. Oftentimes the ACLU of Alabama is looking into public records requests, ways that we can access, what's happening with our state agencies. But that's really difficult to do with parole for one reason. And that is that parole files are not considered discoverable records. Not only can someone who's incarcerated not attend their parole hearing, they have no legal right to their parole file and to the information that's being considered at parole hearings. So we thought that the only way that we could really get a full understanding of what was happening was to be present. So we did that 10-week data collection process. We thought about, how can this be used in the future? But I think the origins of this was really thinking about how can legal and organizing work together towards goals, and how can we increase the amount of advocacy that's happening at parole hearings in Alabama, which is one of our long-term goals of this project.
Yes. Man, I even as somebody who was a part of it and just hearing you talk about it, I think it has been such a creative and important example of doing just what you outlined right there. And Monique, did you want to add anything to kind of the parole watching? Yeah, any to what that looked like and the kind of goals?
Well, as Alison stated, it did, the implementation process took about a good 10 weeks for us to observe the hearings and attend. The response that we received back when we first were attending, the response was just kind of like, hey, how you guys doing? Thank you for coming. But when the information was actually disseminated throughout, throughout the community in a sense, and it was highlighted what was actually happening at parole, the response changed tremendously. We went from a friendly response to, at times where we are not being received well coming in, or just kind of overlooked in a sense. And also, at times, our report has also been referenced as to why they are not releasing people from jail. Yeah. In the sense to say, the ACLU thinks that we should release this type of person, but this is the reason why we're not. And so, it's been some pushback as it relates to, the information, because it doesn't necessarily paint the parole board in a positive light, but it wasn't to not paint them in a positive light. It was really just to give light to truth as to what was actually happening, because there are a lot of people here in Alabama who have no idea how parole works. They have no clue. If you have a conversation with them and you say, hey, have you ever been to a parole hearing? Most people are going to say, no, I haven't been to a parole hearing. They have no reason to go to a parole hearing unless they're either going to support someone or going to oppose someone. But for them not to know is really, really important, because honestly, them having an idea of what's happening in parole will actually help to influence the change that needs to happen, because anybody who would go to parole would have the very same feeling that we have. Something about this process is not right.
Right. And I mean, with it's interesting that there's already being pushback of trying to suggest that with this data, that there's that this is giving justification why parole shouldn't be offered, when it was just a presentation of data, right? Correct. And which is a follow-up question, is if either of you can maybe speak to some of those top line findings of the report itself.
Yeah. So we were really careful about being factual and data driven with this process. There's a lot we could do to editorialize, to talk about our feelings, but we tried to keep that out of the report for the most part. The one thing I thought that was important for us to include is when our law students were going to these hearings throughout the summer, they would do a reflection piece. So in addition to collecting that data, they would do a reflection piece at the end of each day, describe what they saw and describe like what they felt. And when Monique talks about like if people know what's happening, they would be more outraged. We really saw that with our law students. When we looked back at their reflections at the beginning of the summer versus the end of the summer, it radicalizes you to be in that space. It makes you realize that there are things happening that should not be happening. No matter what side you land on, when you spend time in that parole room, you know that this isn't just. This is not how our state should be operating. And so we did include a couple of those observations, those excerpts from our law students' reports, because I felt like it was important for people to know what it actually feels like. We can talk about data, but this is also a very human process. We have people at the heart of this. And so as much as we talk about numbers, we also have to talk about individuals and impact. And so it was important for us to have some of that. But the big piece of this with the data was that we wanted to look at this thesis that the Attorney General, that the governor puts forth, that they are only denying people because that's what's best for public safety, that we have somehow like a disproportionately violent prison population, that Alabama doesn't have people that are ready to re-enter society. And our data showed that that is not what's governing their decisions. And the big thing that we looked at, which is something you can't really get from public records, is for the people that were being considered for parole, where were they housed and what was their institutional history? And what we found is there are the vast majority of people who are at work release, who are going into communities every day and working alongside us. Some of them are even getting home visits once a month where they're going home for a weekend. Those are the people that are being denied parole in Alabama. And so for us, that really undermines this idea that this is about public safety. If it was about public safety, you would see people at work release being granted parole and people at the prisons being denied parole. But there's no correlation between what we're seeing in terms of what someone's custody and facility is and what their outcome is. I think the other thing we were really focused on was the racial disparities. It's been known for years in Alabama that our parole board has increasingly had racially disparate outcomes. And our data showed that as well. We found that Black people being considered for parole were twice as likely to be denied as white people. And when the parole board's been confronted with facts like this in the past, they've said, well, there's other factors happening here. Like, it's not about race. And so one of the things that we did is we tried to look at similarly situated parole applicants who were Black and white parole applicants. And one of the examples that we cite in our report is trafficking marijuana convictions. We had 3 people that we observed parole hearings for over the summer who had that conviction. 2 of them were Black, 1 of them was white. All 3 people were at work release facilities. All 3 people had sentences in the 15 to 20-year range. The only person that got granted parole in that cohort was a white person. And so what we really tried to do is take similarly situated people and see if there is any explanation other than race. And what we found is that there wasn't. So I think that what our big goal with this project was to test what the state has told us and what the state has told the public about why these decisions are trending in this way and see if that's accurate. And overwhelmingly, we found that it wasn't.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for sharing those insights and takeaways. And I think I'm just thinking about how an effort like this can be potentially replicated in other where there are a lot of similar conditions. One as a way of actually offering more direct support in that actual space of where decision making is happening, but to kind of more broadly offer information and shine a light on some of the contradictions that are bound up in the parole system, right? As you point out with the work release statistics. Kind of building off of that, I wonder if either one of you wanted to speak to this question around, the connection, the relationship between legal and community-based advocacy. As obviously this initiative is an example of that, but just more broadly on that, the importance of that and how that has operated in the state in your work more generally.
I could speak a little bit to that. From an advocacy standpoint, there's a very close relationship between the legal ramifications and community-based advocacy, right? Our legal teams or our lawyers of the world, right? They are the ones who go to court to fight. But it is our community who is the ones who inform our legal people what they need to go fight for, right? And so when we talk about community-based advocacy as it relates to the relationship to legal, in order for anything to actually change, for it to be transformative, the community has to be involved in it. If the community is not involved, if they have no input, they have no idea what's going on, then no change can really happen because there's nothing for them to ask for there to be a change. Our community is who's influencing our legislators. They're who is influencing our policy at the end of the day.
I think we just lost Monique for a second. I'll jump in to add on to some of that. I think one of the things that was so critical to us and valuable was having Monique as part of this project. She's someone who's done reentry work, who's been out in the community and making sure that people have the reentry services they need to be successful. And so it was important to us that she have like everything that she needs with her expertise and knowledge to bring that into this project. And so I think what's important is when Monique talks about, lawyers are effective in court. Lawyers oftentimes aren't the most effective people at parole hearings. We can do what we can to contextualize a client's record, to explain, why one disciplinary isn't something that should, dictate outcomes, to give context. But what parole boards are really interested in is what kind of support is someone going to have if we release them on parole. And so for us, I think we have to have some humility as attorneys and as lawyers doing parole work to know that there are lanes where we're really effective, and then there's lanes where advocates and other folks in the community are most effective. And we should work together to reach these outcomes, but it can't just be one or the other doing these types of things, because that's not what's going to be most effective for the client. I think for us as well, when I think of parole, I think of reentry being the cornerstone of that. And so oftentimes lawyers go into court and they win a case, and then that's it. That's the outcome. They're done with their client. I think for legal advocates to be most effective, we have to be thinking about our long-term relationships with our clients. And even if we can't meet their needs, how can reentry specialists do it? How can advocates do it? How can mental health professionals do it? And making sure our clients have those resources, that lawyers just can't fill all those voids.
Thank you for that, Alison. Good to see you back, Monique. I really appreciate the point you make, Alison, about how, which I think often happens, especially as we get really specific, for better or for worse reasons, on our issues that we're like advocating on behalf of, that we lose sight of the kind of comprehensive levels and layers of support that folks need, right? That are also informing the issue itself, how folks are able to show up and being impacted by a specific issue such as parole. So I wanted to, if there follow up even on that piece, if in your advocacy, right, thinking about parole, but also just more generally the work that y'all have been doing in the state, right, in terms of what's most effective. Is there anything you would want to share in your experiences that have strategies that have been effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Monique, I want you to jump in after this too, because I know you have perspectives that are valuable here. But to Monique's earlier point about how parole board decisions are being made before we even appear at these hearings, I think that's a really important and critical reality of what we're facing. And so with the parole work that we do in terms of representation, and what I've seen be most effective is you really have to get materials sent into the board before the hearing even starts. The other thing I've found is that the Department of Corrections, particularly in Alabama, but everywhere, they don't keep complete files on our clients. They always have the bad things in there, but they lose certificates, they lose accomplishments, they misreport on what a person's actual history is. I've even had them do like I had a client at a prison who had the same name as another person there, and they evaluated the other person and then sent that in for this client's parole hearing. And so one of the things that I see like lawyers and all advocates doing, which helps with success, is making sure that the information is accurate that's being considered. I mean, we saw that throughout the summer at parole hearings, where there was one hearing where the person was convicted of attempted murder, and when the vocal advocate got up to speak in opposition, she represented that the person had killed the person. And so we just have gaps in facts that really have to be cleared up as much as we can beforehand. But I have to emphasize that I don't think that the issues that we're seeing with parole boil down just to resources and whether the board is getting complete information. What I'm seeing is that even when they have complete information, they're not willing to consider it because they're so focused on making decisions based on what someone's conviction is.
I like to piggyback off of that. I want to say that I completely agree. It would be one thing if we were in an atmosphere where people were actually being considered for parole based on an individual basis, based on their actual willingness and ability to actually be successful in reentry. We're really looking at things based on their conviction, and everything is really based on trying to prevent them from being in the world or in the public to avoid them repeating that offense. You know, unfortunately, I think what is not really being looked at is statistical data, right? When they're even thinking about making those decisions, even on that basis, right? How many people actually come out and recommit murder? Not many, right? There are some, yes. But again, those are things that are assessed in actual, real assessments through psychologists and things like that. If they were actually using the tools that they have in place to actually do a comprehensive review of someone's ability to come out, I think that we would have a better outcome as it relates to not just release, but actually people having an actual opportunity to be successful in their reentry process, right? Because as you have that landscape of no's all the way down the field, right? With those no's, there's also no resources for anybody to come home to actually be successful, because there's no need for the resource, if I'm making any sense, right? If we're not releasing anybody from jail, then why do we need to have vocational rehabilitation if no one's coming home, right? If we're not releasing anyone from jail, then why do we need to worry about if people have family reintegration if no one is coming home? And so I think that it affects the outside landscape for those who are actually being released, who don't have any resources, because the state of Alabama has no investment in reentry in actual post-release for anybody, and that's as it relates to being released, and even as it relates to not being released. There is like no investment there at all. They want to say that there's an investment in the penal system where people are able to obtain these certificates, but they're, like Alison stated, they're not even being looked at as accomplishments. They're just being looked at as things that they had to do because they were in jail.
Right. I'm struck by, the excuses being made to, if we're not letting folks out, what is the need for reentry services? And then at the same time, we're not letting folks out because many times the argument is there's not enough support on the outside, right? And I guess that feeds into a quick follow-up around just the broader political environment in Alabama that this parole fight is up against, right? And if you want to speak to any of the like unique characteristics of that struggle and the political environment there.
Yeah, so earlier I talked about how Alabama had a parole grant rate of about 50% 5 years ago. There was an incident that happened in Alabama that was highly politicized and resulted in state officials taking some drastic measures to shut down parole. And we've seen this in other states as well, where you have a really unfortunate circumstance where someone who's out on parole is implicated in another offense. And that is then used to be emblematic somehow of everyone who's being released on parole. So about 5 years ago, there was a parolee named Jimmy Spencer who was implicated in a triple homicide. And that led to a knee-jerk reaction by our state officials to effectively shut down parole. There's been reporting on this where the governor and Attorney General Steve Marshall called the parole board members into a closed meeting and basically said, stop letting people out. So after that, Lynn Head at that time was the chair of the parole board. She was making decisions that were informed by data, by the types of guidelines that the parole board's supposed to follow. And she got pushed out of her job. She was doing her job as it was written, but she was not following what the governor and what the attorney general wanted her to do. And the person that was put in Lynn Head's place is a woman named Lee Gwathney. Lee Gwathney is a career prosecutor. She worked in the attorney general's office before she was appointed to the parole board. And this also relates to one of the findings we had over the summer. Usually in court, if a judge used to work at an office, if someone on the Court of Appeals used to be the district attorney in another county, you recuse yourself. Lee Gwathney doesn't recuse herself from the cases that the attorney general's office opposes. And we found that in 100% of the cases that the attorney general's office voiced opposition, Lee Gwathney voted to deny parole. And so that vote, Lee Gwathney's vote, virtually no one is going to get her grant vote. And so it leaves the decision-making in two people's hands. And there's been a lot of kind of people taking those seats, leaving them. What we saw over the summer is that Kim Davidson had been appointed to the board in the spring. And her decisions over the summer were, she granted parole at rates higher than Lee Gwathney, but still was only voting to grant people at about a rate of 20%. She was being too lenient. So when the governor had to appoint someone to that 6-year term, Kim Davidson wasn't on that list. So what we're seeing is that there's parole board members being put in seats on interim basis. And if they are letting too many people out on parole, and when I say too many, I'm not talking like thousands of people by any means, just going slightly over 10%, they don't get a chance to stay in that seat permanently. And we're in another inflection point right now. So the person who is now occupying Kim Davidson's seat is named Gabrielle Simmons. Miss Simmons won't be confirmed to that seat until the legislative session begins in the spring. And so even if she wanted to make decisions that were informed by statistics, that were informed about what's really consistent with public safety, she risks her job if she makes those decisions. We saw it with Lynn Head, we saw it with Kim Davidson. And so it really puts parole board members in a position where they can't make the decisions they know they need to and also preserve their ability to keep that job. Is there anything you want to add to that, Monique?
In addition to that, yes. It also speaks to the mindset of the political environment of those who are able to change the policy. They very much are influencing the decisions of the board. That says a lot. That's a lot. That policymakers who don't work at parole are influencing the decisions that parole board members are making, right? And also similar to what Alison stated as well, in many cases, it almost feels like the denial is because of personal beliefs, personal values, personal morals that they believe people do not have and are unsuitable to be in the community just based on their own, you know, conservative beliefs, to just, you know, boil it all the way down to the end.
Thank you both for sharing that. I think, you know, not only is it just 3 board members, but it's the process as you described it as just this highly hyper political board that's then being taken in, that's being kind of held hostage by this conservative. It's either like you get with the program or you're not. It's not even, it doesn't even sound like a discretionary board for these board members. So, you know, I think, yeah, thank you for laying that out for us. My last question really is just looking forward, looking ahead. What's next for this parole watching initiative and your goals looking ahead for parole reform in the state?
Yeah. So I think that this effort for us is long-term. We did this 10-week data collection process, put out our report in September. And I think the parole board thought, oh, we're done with them. We won't have to see them anymore after our report came out. But that first Tuesday after the report came out, we had a staff member there. And when Monique's talking about some of the antagonism, that's when it really started. I think they thought we were just casual observers. And then once they saw the report and saw that the ACLU of Alabama was going to hold them to account, we weren't as welcome as we had been before, but that hasn't stopped us. We can't do 3 days a week for capacity reasons, but we have someone on staff, most often Monique, there 1 day a week, collecting information about what's happening, but more than anything, just having that presence. We've gotten feedback from people that have observed parole hearings that it's different when we're in the room. It's more on task. It's less, it can get, when we're talking about conservatism, there are like very overt Christian values that get espoused and pushed in these parole hearings. And from the feedback we've gotten, that has tempered down since the ACLU of Alabama has been present at the hearings. And so that's encouraging. We're trying to bring more transparency and objectivity to these proceedings. But I think what we observe throughout this summer and what we see as the biggest need are resources for incarcerated people and their loved ones to be most prepared to go in front of them. And so one of our priorities from going forward, and this is something we're working on with other organizational partners, is a pro se guide for incarcerated people so that they know about like what type of information should you get in front of the parole board, but also really for their family members. Since incarcerated people don't get to have a presence at these hearings, their most effective advocates are their loved ones. And it's really disheartening when we talk about people not knowing about parole, it's even folks that are really, really impacted. And so oftentimes when Monique's at the parole board, she's being asked questions by family members like, what is this even going to be like? What should I say? Like, and so I think we want to be able to step in and give people guidance on that area. But more broadly, the legislature in Alabama has an opportunity and has a need to act here. Representative Chris England has introduced parole reform bills year after year, and they die in committee. There's legislation that's going to be proposed next session that we're in support of. One of them is to ensure a virtual presence for people at their parole hearings. During COVID, all of these prisons had to get the equipment to make sure that people could go to their court appearances virtually. So they don't have the infrastructure arguments that they did before that, oh, it'll be too costly, it'll be too difficult. The equipment exists, just give people the opportunity to participate in their proceedings. So that's one bill we'll be supporting next session. Another big priority for us is that we are seeing so many elderly folks and desperately sick folks who are being denied parole and being set off for so many years that they're not actually going to have an opportunity at a parole hearing again. And so we're working with a coalition of organizations and advocates to support parole reform in particular for that population, to make sure that the parole board's following the guidelines and considering the factors they should, and also reducing the amount of time that comes between their next parole hearing. So one of our goals is to make that set off a maximum of 1 or 2 years instead of 5 years. So those are things we'll be working on through the next legislative session. But in the same way that we've recognized that like organizing legal integrated advocacy is what's most effective here, that's something we'll be prioritizing as an office going forward.
Amazing. Amazing. Did you want anything to add to that, Monique, or no? Wow. Well,
Allison hit that on the nose.
fantastic. Well, I'm really excited about the direction that you kind of outlined, and I'm going to be here ready to tap in and support, and I know our other parole advocates that are in this growing network will be looking for ways to see also how this initiative develops. So thank you for the work that y'all are doing. For our audience members, if you want to show some love in the chat, thank you. Give it up to our amazing speakers. I think it's really critical to have these sorts of creative initiatives, especially that are kind of bridging advocacy strategies outlined and shared with community and advocates that are trying to push forward parole reform all around the country. So thank you very much for the work that y'all are doing. And thank you for our audience members for tuning in to this. The information, this was recorded. So if there's somebody you think that would have benefited from hearing today's kind of breakdown from Alison and Monique, it will be on our MacArthur Justice. We have a parole teach-in playlist where all of these teach-ins are being hosted and archived and are being made accessible. And you can check us out, MacArthur Justice Center, on social media, and our YouTube channel specifically is where that playlist lives. But yeah, there will be a couple more teach-ins coming into the new year. This is the last teach-in of this year, so be on the lookout. And yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Timmy. Really appreciate the work y'all are doing and how you're bringing states together. I know that with parole and all legal work, oftentimes we kind of work in state silos. And so I really appreciate all the work that y'all are doing to bring us together and find ways that we can learn from each other. So thank you.
Definitely.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for having us. And thank you guys for participating and listening and joining the cause and the fight, because it's something that has to be happening throughout the United States and not just in Alabama. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you. And yes, folks, stay tuned for some more. All right. Have a good one.